The night Marcus Hale was humiliated, he was wearing his dead father's watch. It was the kind of watch that does not impress anyone at a charity gala. No diamonds, no platinum, no brand name that turns heads across a crowded room. It was a 1967 Omega Seamaster with a scratched crystal and a leather strap that had been resold twice. Marcus had cleaned it that evening with the same cloth he used to wipe his daughter's lunchbox. He had not noticed the small smear of axle grease still caught beneath the crown. He noticed it later. After everything, the gala was held at the Meridian Hotel in downtown Chicago, inside a ballroom that smelled of lilies and old money. Marcus did not belong there by birthright. He had been invited because the charity, a children's literacy foundation, had accepted a modest donation from his shop, Hale Restorations, a one-man garage operation tucked between a laundromat and a Vietnamese restaurant on the west side. The invitation had arrived on cardstock so thick it felt almost embarrassing to hold. His daughter Lily, who was 9 years old and already a better reader than most adults Marcus knew, had held it up to the kitchen light and whispered, "Dad, it's the fancy kind." He had worn his one good jacket. He had combed his hair. He had driven there in his 2003 pickup truck and handed the keys to a valet who did not quite manage to hide his expression. Marcus was used to expressions like that. He had been a single father for 6 years, since Lily's mother left without a note and without a forwarding address. He had raised Lily on a mechanic's income and a restorer's obsession, an obsession that most people, including his own brother, considered a spectacular waste of time. He did not restore ordinary cars. He restored lost ones, vehicles that arrived at his garage on flatbeds, sometimes in pieces, sometimes so corroded that a layman would have called them scrap. Marcus called them candidates. He saw in them what others had stopped seeing, and he gave them back something that could not be manufactured: new authenticity. History. The particular silence of a machine that was built by human hands in a specific year, in a specific place for a specific reason. None of that was visible in his jacket. The billionaire's name was Conrad Voss. He was 54 years old, broad-shouldered, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes not just from wealth but from being told repeatedly that one's instincts are correct. He had made his first fortune in commercial real estate, his second in logistics technology, and his third, the one that made the first two feel like warm-up acts, in early-stage venture capital. He collected things: art, properties, and, notably, classic automobiles. He was known in certain circles as a man who could walk through a room of vintage cars and identify value faster than most people could read a price tag. He did not consider this a hobby. He considered it evidence of something innate. Conrad Voss noticed Marcus the way a man like that notices an out-of-place thing, not with cruelty at first but with the reflexive instinct to categorize. Marcus had been standing near a silent auction table, holding a glass of sparkling water he hadn't touched, studying a photograph of a 1954 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL on the wall. He was studying it the way he studied everything mechanical, quietly, completely, as if the rest of the room had simply ceased to exist. Voss approached because the car in the photograph was one he had nearly purchased 3 years ago. He had let it go. He sometimes wondered if that had been a mistake. They talked briefly, or rather, Voss talked and Marcus listened, responding in the careful, measured way of a man who chooses his words like tools, selecting only what is necessary. When Voss asked what Marcus did, Marcus told him simply, "I restore automobiles. Mostly pre-war, some post-war European." Voss smiled in a way that was not unkind but was not quite respectful either. He asked if Marcus knew anything about a 1937 Bugatti Type 57 that had apparently surfaced somewhere in the Midwest. He'd heard rumors. He'd dismissed them as the usual wishful folklore that circulated in collector circles. Marcus said quietly that he did know something about it. Voss's smile shifted. He tilted his head. He asked to know more. And Marcus, carefully and without drama, described what he had spent the last 11 months working on inside his garage. The vehicle, the provenance research, the parts, the process. He did not exaggerate. He did not perform. He simply described the work the way a surgeon might describe a procedure. Precisely, without ego, with the deep calm of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. Conrad Voss listened. And then, in front of 4 other guests who had drifted close enough to hear, he laughed. Not cruelly. That would have been easier to carry. He laughed the way a man laughs when he is genuinely entertained, warmly, almost affectionately, and he said, "Friend, a West Side garage and a Type 57 in the same sentence. That car, if it even exists, is worthless in the wrong hands. Restoration is about more than patience. It takes resources, networks, expertise. No offense meant, but you're describing a very expensive fantasy." The four guests smiled. One of them touched Voss's arm in the way that people touch the arms of men they agree with. Marcus said nothing. He set down his sparkling water on the edge of the table. He looked once more at the photograph of the 1954 Mercedes on the wall. And then he said very quietly, "Thank you for the conversation," and he walked to the exit, retrieved his truck from the valet, and drove home to the west side. Lily was asleep on the folding cot he kept in the corner of the garage for nights she didn't want to be alone in the house. Her reading lamp was still on. A book was open, face down, across her chest. Marcus sat on his work stool for a long time. He did not say anything. He did not make any calls. He picked up his wrench, and he went back to work. Marcus Hale had learned to read engines before he learned to read books. His father, Raymond Hale, had been a line mechanic at a Ford assembly plant for 31 years. A man who came home every evening smelling of metal and solvent, who ate dinner quietly, who asked about homework, and who, on Saturday mornings, took young Marcus into the driveway and taught him the only theology he believed in. That a machine, properly understood, would never lie to you. People hide things, Raymond used to say. His hands deep in an engine bay. His voice carrying the particular calm of a man who had made peace with the world's disappointments. Machines don't. You just have to learn how to listen. Marcus had listened. He had listened so well that by the time he was 14, he could diagnose an engine fault by sound alone. A skill that struck his teachers as irrelevant and his classmates as strange, but that felt to Marcus as natural and necessary as breathing. He was not a remarkable student in the ways that schools measured. He was not loud. He did not raise his hand. But he read everything he could find about automotive history, not the popular kind, not the glossy magazine kind, but the deep kind. The kind found in out-of-print technical manuals, in the correspondence archives of defunct coach builders, in the brittle catalogs of European marques that had ceased to exist before his father was born. He had wanted to go to engineering school. There had been a scholarship application, half completed on the kitchen table, the night Raymond Hale had his first stroke. Marcus was 17. He set the application aside. He never picked it up again. He worked. He worked at a dealership, then at a specialty shop, then at a restoration house in Milwaukee where he spent 4 years learning from a man named Otto Brecht, a German-born restorer in his 70s who had worked on pre-war coach-built automobiles since the 1960s, and who treated every vehicle as an artifact of human civilization rather than a commodity. Otto was the first person who had ever looked at Marcus the way Marcus felt, as if he contained something precise and rare and worth developing. "You have the eye," Otto told him once, without ceremony, the way a man states a fact rather than offers a compliment. Most people who want to do this work love cars. You love what cars remember. That is different. That is the thing that cannot be taught. Otto died in 2014. He left Marcus his tools, his library, and a single unfinished vehicle, a 1938 Talbot Lego that Marcus completed over the following 2 years and sold quietly, without fanfare, for enough money to open his own shop. By then, Lily had arrived. Her mother's name was Diana. She was bright, restless, and fundamentally unsuited to stillness, which was perhaps why she and Marcus had worked, briefly, and then hadn't. Marcus did not speak badly of her. He never had, not even in the early months when the hurt was fresh and Lily was 3 years old and asking questions Marcus didn't know how to answer. He had decided early that Lily would not grow up carrying the weight of her parents' failure. She would grow up carrying only what she chose to carry. So he gave her everything he had learned to give. Consistency, attention, the particular safety of a parent who shows up the same way every single day regardless of what the day has cost him. He made her breakfast every morning. He read to her every night. He taught her, when she was old enough to sit on a work stool without falling, how to identify a car by its silhouette alone. A game they played on road trips, Lily pressing her nose to the window, calling out makes and models with the competitive delight of a child who understood that this was something her father loved, and therefore something worth loving. The garage was not glamorous. It was cold in winter and sweltering by July. The neighborhood was not the kind that attracted foot traffic or admiring glances. Marcus had one employee, a young man named Dev, 23 years old, who had shown up one afternoon asking for an apprenticeship and who Marcus had hired not because he needed the help but because Dev reminded him of himself at that age. Hungry to understand something deeply, uncertain whether the world would make room for that hunger. The work itself was the thing that sustained him. Not the money, though he charged well, and the people who knew what he could do paid without argument. Not the recognition, though there were photographs of his restorations in 3 European collector publications and a quiet, devoted following among the kind of enthusiasts who communicated through private forums and handwritten letters rather than social media. It was the work itself, the process of taking something ruined and returning it to truth. He had been doing it alone for a long time. He was used to that too. To understand why Conrad Voss said what he said, you have to understand what Conrad Voss had built himself into believing. He had not started wealthy. That was the detail he returned to most often in interviews, in keynote speeches, in the carefully crafted narrative he had assembled around his own life. The detail that did the most work, that made the most people lean forward. He had grown up in a mid-sized Ohio city, the son of a hardware store owner who died when Conrad was 22, leaving behind a small estate, a moderate amount of debt, and the foundational lesson that working hard in a straight line would get you only so far. Conrad had not worked in a straight line. He had worked in angles. He had seen things sideways, identified value in spaces others had written off, moved before the consensus caught up. He had been right enough times, early enough times, that a specific belief had calcified inside him, that he possessed a form of perception that most people simply lacked. This belief was not entirely wrong. That was what made it dangerous. He was genuinely gifted at reading markets, at identifying the moment before momentum, that thin, electric instant when something overlooked was about to become something coveted. His automotive collection was a physical extension of this gift. 41 vehicles, housed in a climate-controlled facility outside Scottsdale, Arizona. Every one of them acquired at a point when the market had not yet agreed on their value. Every one of them now worth multiples of what he had paid. He had been featured in 3 collector publications. He had consulted informally for 2 major auction houses. He had spoken at Pebble Beach. He used words like provenance and coachwork and numbers matching with the fluency of a man who had studied the vocabulary carefully and deployed it often enough that it had become his own. But there was a distinction, a quiet, crucial distinction, that Conrad Voss had never fully reckoned with. He knew value. He did not know the work. He had never spent 11 months on a single vehicle. He had never sourced a period-correct carburetor from a parts dealer in rural France through a chain of correspondence that took 4 months to complete. He had never lain on a cold concrete floor at 2 in the morning, tracing the original paint layers of a coach-built body with a magnifying loupe, trying to determine whether what he was seeing was factory lacquer or a post-war repaint. He had never had to make the decision, the agonizing, ethically loaded decision, between what was restorable and what was replacement, between authenticity and appearance. He acquired. He did not restore. And because he had never done the work, he had no true map of what the work required. He had metrics instead. Square footage, equipment, staff, network access. These were the things he associated with serious restoration, institutional resources, professional infrastructure, the kind of visible apparatus that signals legitimacy to people who evaluate legitimacy by what they can see. A one-man garage on the west side of Chicago did not have visible apparatus. Therefore, by Conrad Voss's internal logic, which was the only logic he had genuinely tested, it could not produce serious work. This was not malice. It was the particular blindness of a man who had been right so many times that he had stopped checking his assumptions. It was the blindness of someone who had confused the map for the territory, who had learned to trust pattern recognition so completely that he no longer looked carefully at what was actually in front of him. After the gala, Conrad had mentioned the conversation to his assistant, a passing comment, barely worth cataloging. He had described Marcus as a hobbyist with big ideas, and then moved on to other things. He did not think about Marcus again. He did not think about the 1937 Bugatti Type 57. He did not think about the West Side garage, or the child asleep on the folding cot, or the man sitting on a work stool in the cold deciding without drama, without audience, and without any need for external confirmation, to simply finish what he had started. Conrad Voss went to sleep that night in a hotel suite on the 14th floor, satisfied with the evening, untroubled by doubt. Outside, on the expressway, Marcus's pickup truck moved through the dark city. Inside it, the 1967 Omega Seamaster ticked steadily on his wrist. The grease was still caught beneath the crown. He hadn't noticed it yet. The 1937 Bugatti Type 57 had arrived at Hale Restorations on a flatbed truck on a Tuesday morning in February, 11 months before the gala. It had come from an estate in southern Indiana, the property of a man named Gerald Voss, a retired civil engineer who had purchased the car in 1971 from a private seller in Antwerp, shipped it to the United States, stored it in a barn on his property, and then, with the gradual intention of restoring it someday, allowed someday to become 50 years. Gerald Voss had died in the autumn without restoring it. His daughter, who knew nothing about cars and cared only that the estate be settled cleanly, had found Marcus through a collector's forum after 3 other restoration shops had either declined the project or offered prices she considered insulting. Marcus had driven to Indiana to see it before agreeing to anything. He had stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. The car was in poor condition by any casual assessment. The coachwork was heavily oxidized. The fabric of the original interior had disintegrated almost completely. The engine, a 3.3-liter double overhead cam straight 8, one of the most sophisticated power plants of its era, had not run in decades. 2 of the wheels were original. 2 were replacements of uncertain date. Beneath the accumulated damage of time and neglect, the body showed evidence of at least one significant impact, repaired at some unknown point with body filler that had since cracked and separated. A casual observer would have seen a wreck. Marcus saw something else entirely. He crouched beside the left front wheel arch for nearly 10 minutes. He produced a small loop from his jacket pocket and examined the paint at the arch's inner edge, a sheltered area, protected from the worst of the oxidation. He examined the firewall stampings. He traced the coachwork seams with his fingertip, reading them the way a scholar reads a primary text. Then he stood up and he said to Gerald Voss's daughter very quietly, "I'll take it." What Marcus had seen, what no one else had looked closely enough to find, was this: the car was original. Not merely old. Original. Beneath the oxidation and the damage and the decades of accumulated entropy, every major structural component was the car that had left the Bugatti factory in Molsheim in 1937. The firewall stampings matched documented records. The coachwork, despite its condition, bore the unmistakable characteristics of a specific atelier, a French coach builder whose work on Type 57 chassis was both rare and rigorously documented. The body filler repair, properly examined, was superficial, covering a panel crease rather than structural damage. The engine, though seized, was intact and original to the chassis. A numbers matching, coach-built 1937 Bugatti Type 57 from a documented atelier. In the world of pre-war European collector automobiles, this was not a car. It was an event. But knowing what it was and proving what it was were different disciplines entirely. And proving it, building the chain of documentation that would satisfy the scrutiny of a major auction house, that would allow the car to be presented to the world's most serious collectors with full confidence in its identity, required a different kind of genius than the mechanical kind. Marcus spent the first 3 months on provenance alone. He corresponded with the Bugatti Trust in England. He contacted the Mullen Automotive Museum in California. He located, through a researcher in Paris, a partial factory ledger entry that corresponded to the chassis number. He commissioned an independent metallurgical analysis of the engine block stampings. He found in a German collector's archive a single pre-war photograph, grainy, partially obscured, that showed the car at a concours event in 1938, identifiable by a specific coachwork detail on the rear quarter. Each piece of documentation was cross-referenced, verified, and filed. Then he began the restoration itself. He sourced the carburetor from a dismantled parts car in Lyon through a contact he had maintained for 8 years. He found period-correct upholstery fabric through a textile restorer in Milan who specialized in pre-war French automobiles. He rebuilt the engine by hand, alone, working from both original factory specifications and from the accumulated knowledge of a technical community that communicated across continents through forums, correspondence, and the particular generosity that exists among people who love the same obscure and difficult thing. Dev helped with the bodywork preparation. The rest Marcus did himself. Lily visited the garage every afternoon after school. She did her homework on the work stool while Marcus worked. Some evenings she fell asleep there before dinner, and Marcus would carry her inside and return to the garage and work past midnight beneath the fluorescent lights while the neighborhood went quiet around him. He never told anyone what he believed the car was worth. He simply did the work. Completely. Correctly. Without shortcuts and without audience. The way his father had taught him. 3 days after the gala, Marcus received a letter. It was not a threatening letter. In some ways, that would have been simpler. It was a letter from the auction house, Hargrove and Leland, one of the 2 firms in North America with the international reach and collector relationships necessary to handle a car of this caliber. He had submitted the vehicle documentation 6 weeks earlier, before the gala, before any of it. He had submitted it carefully, completely, with the full provenance file, the metallurgical analysis, the factory ledger correspondence, the pre-war photograph, the independent assessments. The letter informed him that Hargrove and Leland had reviewed his submission and had concerns. Not about the car. Not about the provenance documentation, which their specialist had described, in language Marcus read 3 times in the cold of the garage, as unusually thorough and compelling. About him. The letter was diplomatic. It used words like alignment and presentation and the expectations of our consignor relationships. But beneath the careful corporate phrasing, the message was clear enough. Hargrove and Leland was uncertain whether a one-man operation from the west side of Chicago was the appropriate context from which to present an 8-figure pre-war Bugatti to their clientele. They had questions about the shop's professional standing. They had questions about insurance and storage. They had questions, implicit, never quite stated directly, about whether Marcus himself projected the kind of credibility their buyers expected from a consignor. Marcus sat with the letter for a long time. He was not naive. He had understood, in the abstract, that this moment might come, that the work and the documentation could be unimpeachable and the world could still find a reason to hesitate. He had understood it the way you understand things you hope won't happen. Theoretically, at a distance, with the private confidence that your preparation will be sufficient. Sitting in the garage with the letter in his hand, he felt the distance collapse. Dev found him there an hour later and read the letter without being asked to. Dev was 23 and had grown up in a neighborhood not unlike this one and understood, without requiring explanation, exactly what the letter was really saying. He set it down on the workbench and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "So what do we do?" Marcus appreciated that. The we. He called 3 people that evening. The first was the independent appraiser who had conducted the metallurgical analysis, a man named Dr. Philip Okafor, a materials scientist at Northwestern who collected pre-war automobiles as a serious avocation and who had, over the course of their correspondence, developed a deep respect for both the car and the work. Okafor listened carefully and said he would write a letter. Not a technical letter. A letter. The second call was to a collector Marcus had restored a vehicle for 4 years earlier, a 1952 Ferrari 212 Inter that had sold privately for a significant sum and whose new owner, a Zurich-based industrialist named Thomas Bauer, had written Marcus a handwritten note afterward that Marcus had kept in the top drawer of his desk ever since. Bauer's assistant answered. Marcus left a message. Bauer called back within the hour. The third call was the hardest. It was to a retired Bugatti specialist named Henri Marchand, 81 years old, living outside Strasbourg, a man who had handled more pre-war Bugattis than perhaps anyone alive and whose name in the collector world functioned less like a credential and more like a verdict. Marcus had corresponded with Marchand during the provenance research. Their exchanges had been formal, careful, mutually respectful. Marcus had never asked Marchand for anything beyond information. He asked now. There was a long silence on the line. Then Marchand, in the careful English he used for international calls, said, "Monsieur Hale, I have read your documentation. I was wondering when you would call." That night, Lily found Marcus sitting at the kitchen table after she had come in from the garage. She looked at his face, the way children who have been raised by a single parent learn to read a face, quickly, completely, with the particular fluency born of necessity, and she climbed onto the chair beside him without asking what was wrong. She opened her book. She read aloud for 20 minutes, her voice steady and clear in the quiet kitchen, while Marcus sat beside her and let the sound of it work on him the way only certain things can. Not solving anything, not promising anything, but making the room feel less like a place where a man could be beaten by paperwork and doubt. After a while, he reached over and tucked her hair behind her ear. He said, "We're going to be okay." He wasn't certain of it yet, but he said it like he was. The letter from Henri Marchand arrived at Hargrove and Leland on a Thursday morning. It was 2 pages, handwritten in French with a typed English translation attached, a formality that Marchand had apparently considered important. His assistant had sent it by courier rather than email. Marcus learned this detail later and understood it immediately. Marchand had chosen the medium deliberately, the way a man of his age and standing chooses everything deliberately, because a courier envelope on a Thursday morning from the foremost living authority on pre-war Bugatti automobiles communicated something that an email simply could not. Communicated, "Pay attention." Marcus did not know exactly what the letter said. Marchand had not shared a copy. But he knew its substance because Marchand had told him plainly during their second call, "I am telling them what the car is. And I am telling them who did the work. Both things are true. Both things are important. In my experience, when both things are true, the rest resolves itself." It resolved itself on Friday. The call came from a senior specialist at Hargrove and Leland named Catherine Elroy, a woman whose voice carried the particular composure of someone who has made many significant calls and learned to deliver all of them with the same measured register regardless of the news. She told Marcus that following additional review of the consignment documentation, including correspondence received from Mr. Henri Marchand and Dr. Philip Okafor, and a supplementary character reference from collector Thomas Bauer of Zurich, Hargrove and Leland was pleased to move forward with the consignment. She told him the car would be included in their flagship autumn sale. She told him the pre-sale estimate they intended to publish. Marcus sat down while she was still talking. The pre-sale low estimate was $6 million. He had believed in the car from the beginning. He had believed in the work. But there is a particular species of moment, rare in a life, recognizable immediately when it arrives, when the thing you have known privately in your bones is confirmed publicly in the world, and the two truths meeting each other produces something that is not quite joy and not quite relief but exists in the register of both. Marcus had not cried since his father's funeral. He did not cry now, but he sat in the chair for a long time after the call ended, in the quiet of the garage, with the restored Bugatti 30 feet away beneath its cover, and he felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't fully realized he'd been holding. Dev came in 20 minutes later, read Marcus's face the way he had learned to read it, and said, "Good news?" Marcus said, "Start cleaning the shop. We're going to have visitors." The visitors came the following week. 2 specialists from Hargrove and Leland drove from New York. They arrived in a black SUV, dressed in the particular way of people whose professional identity is bound up in seriousness, and they walked around the restored Bugatti for 40 minutes without speaking much, examining the coachwork, the interior, the engine bay, the undercarriage. They asked precise technical questions and received precise technical answers. At one point, the senior specialist, a tall, careful man named James Park, crouched beside the left front wheel arch and examined the paint at the inner edge, and Marcus recognized the gesture and said nothing, only watched, and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who laid his groundwork so thoroughly that even the scrutiny becomes a kind of confirmation. Before they left, Park shook Marcus's hand and said, "This is exceptional work, Mr. Hale. Genuinely exceptional." Marcus said, "Thank you." He did not say, "A man in a hotel ballroom told me it was a fantasy." He did not need to. The auction was held on a Saturday, 7 days after Catherine Elroy's call. Marcus attended. He wore the same jacket. He wore his father's watch. He had cleaned the grease from beneath the crown the morning after the gala, sitting at the kitchen table at 5 a.m., using a toothpick and the careful patience of a man who attends to small things because he has learned that small things matter. Lily was with him, wearing a dress she had chosen herself, navy blue with small white buttons, which she had told Marcus gravely was the professional kind. She held his hand during the bidding. The car sold for $8,200,000. When the gavel came down, Lily looked up at Marcus and whispered, Dad. Just that. Just his name. The way she said it, quiet, certain, full, was worth more than the number on the board. Conrad Voss was in the room. Marcus saw him once, across the crowd, in the moment after the gavel fell. Their eyes met briefly. Voss's expression was not simple. It contained something that Marcus, in his generosity, chose to read as recognition rather than shame. Marcus nodded once. Then he looked back at his daughter. They stopped for pancakes on the way home. It was Lily's request, immediate, practical, delivered in the back seat of the cab with the same directness she applied to most things. She had attended an $8 million auction in her navy dress and white buttons, and she wanted pancakes from the diner on Ashland Avenue, the one with the orange vinyl booths and the coffee that came in mugs the size of soup bowls. Marcus said yes before she finished asking. They sat across from each other in a booth by the window, and Lily ate with the focused efficiency of a 9-year-old who had waited patiently through a long afternoon of adult proceedings and was now claiming her rightful reward. Marcus drank his coffee. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary Saturday way. People walking dogs, a produced truck double-parked, 2 boys on bikes cutting the crosswalk too close and laughing about it. He had been in this city his whole life. He had worked in it, been passed over in it, been invisible in it. He had buried his father in it. He had raised his daughter in it. He had built something real inside it, in a cold garage between a laundromat and a Vietnamese restaurant, in the hours before and after school, in the years that looked from the outside like nothing much was happening and from the inside felt like the entire weight of a life being lifted slowly by hand, one component at a time. He thought about his father. Raymond Hale had never seen any of this. He had died before Lily was born, before the shop existed, before any of the restorations that had quietly built Marcus's reputation in the circles where reputation was built quietly or not at all. He had died knowing his son was skilled and serious and unlikely to be rewarded for it in the ways the world most visibly rewarded things. He had died trusting, Marcus believed, that the work would be enough. That doing the thing correctly, in the right spirit, for the right reasons, was its own form of permanence. That it persisted regardless of whether anyone was paying attention. Machines don't lie, Raymond had said. You just have to learn how to listen. Marcus had listened. For 30 years, he had listened with a patience that the world had occasionally interpreted as passivity, and that had in fact been the most active and deliberate thing about him. A refusal to stop doing the work because the work had not yet been recognized. A refusal to mistake invisibility for failure. He thought about Conrad Voss briefly, without heat. He did not wish the man ill. He never had. Voss had said what he said from inside the logic of his own experience, and that experience, broad, impressive, genuine in its way, had simply not contained the room to imagine what Marcus was actually doing. That was not a sin. That was a limitation. Marcus had limitations too. He had learned, over a life of quiet work, that the most dangerous thing about a limitation was not the limitation itself but the certainty that it did not exist. He hoped, without expectation, that Voss had learned something. He suspected it might take a while. Lily looked up from her pancakes and said, "Are we rich now?" Marcus considered this with appropriate seriousness. He said, "We have more than we had this morning." She thought about this. She said, "Can we get a dog?" He laughed. A real laugh, the kind that starts low and surprises the person doing it. He said, "We can talk about a dog." She pointed her fork at him with the precision of a child who understood negotiation. She said, "That's a yes." He did not correct her. He paid the check. He left a tip that was larger than he had ever left in this diner, or perhaps in any diner, because it was Saturday morning and the car had sold and the waitress had refilled his coffee without being asked, and because there are moments in a life when generosity feels not like a choice but like the only appropriate response to what the world has just done for you. Outside, Lily took his hand. The October air was sharp and bright, the particular quality of Chicago autumn that cuts clean through whatever you are wearing and reminds you that you are here, present, alive, in a city that does not especially care about you and that you love anyway. Marcus looked at his watch. The scratched crystal, the worn leather, the small, steady face that had sat on his father's wrist for 20 years before sitting on his. It was ticking. It had always been ticking. He and Lily walked to the corner, turned south, and disappeared into the ordinary Saturday morning. A man and his daughter and the long, unhurried future opening before them like a road he already knew how to read. Nobody watched them go. Nobody needed to.